When people talk about taking a break in a marriage, it often sounds gentle, even thoughtful. It is framed as self-care, reflection, or a necessary pause. Yet breaks are rarely neutral. They test power, expectations, and unspoken agreements. This story matters because it shows what happens when words are finally treated as literal truth instead of emotional signals meant to be negotiated. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Laura and Daniel had been married for over a decade. From the outside, their life appeared stable. They shared routines, responsibilities, and a quiet rhythm that had carried them through many years. Still, something in Laura had been building slowly. One evening, after dinner, she sat across from Daniel and spoke carefully, as if rehearsing each sentence in her mind. She said she felt tired, not physically exhausted but mentally worn down. She explained that she needed a break to figure herself out, to sit with her thoughts without noise or pressure. She did not use the word divorce. She did not accuse Daniel of wrongdoing. Her tone was calm, almost practiced. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask what exactly she meant by break or how long it would last. He did not demand reassurance. When Laura finished speaking, he nodded once. He said he understood. His response surprised her by its simplicity. There was no argument, no negotiation, no emotional plea. He accepted her words exactly as they were spoken. The narrator pauses here to note something important. In many relationships, requests for space are not meant to be taken at face value. They are often invitations for reassurance, pursuit, or proof of devotion. When those signals are met with quiet acceptance instead, the dynamic shifts immediately. Laura packed a small bag 2 days later. She said she would stay with a friend for a while. Daniel helped her carry the bag to the car. He wished her well and told her to take the time she needed. There was no visible tension, only an unfamiliar stillness. When the car pulled away, Daniel stood for a moment, then went back inside and closed the door. The first days after Laura left were uneventful. Daniel woke up, went to work, and returned to a quieter house. He cooked simple meals. He went for evening walks. He did not check Laura's social media. He did not send messages asking how she was feeling. This silence was not fueled by anger or pride. It was rooted in respect. Laura had asked for space, and Daniel gave it fully. Here, the narrator offers a brief reflection. Silence is often misunderstood. In many stories, silence is framed as punishment or manipulation. But there is another form of silence that comes from boundaries. When someone clearly asks for distance, honoring that request can be the most honest response. As the days passed, Laura began to notice the absence more than she expected. She had imagined occasional messages, small check-ins, perhaps signs that Daniel was waiting. Instead, there was nothing. After nearly a week, she sent a short message asking how he was doing. Daniel replied politely. His response was brief, calm, and respectful. There was no emotional weight behind it. A few days later, Laura sent another message, this time longer. She mentioned missing familiar routines. Daniel responded again, kind but measured. He did not ask when she would return. He did not express loneliness. He simply answered what was asked. The narrator pauses again to analyze the shift taking place. When one partner has always been emotionally available, their sudden neutrality can feel unsettling. It removes the familiar feedback loop. The absence of pursuit can be interpreted as indifference, even when it is not. Laura's messages became more frequent. The questions grew more personal. She hinted at uncertainty. She wondered aloud if the break was helping or only making things harder. Daniel continued to respond without hostility, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer tried to restore the old pattern where her doubts were met with reassurance and effort. He was present, but no longer reactive. This moment reveals a deeper truth about boundaries. When boundaries are unclear, one person often carries the emotional weight for both. Once that weight is set down, the imbalance becomes visible. Daniel did not see himself as punishing Laura. He believed he was honoring her request while also protecting his own stability. He began to notice how much of his energy had once been spent managing uncertainty. Without that task, his days felt simpler, quieter, and more grounded. Laura sensed the difference. She felt unsettled, not because Daniel had done something wrong, but because he had stopped doing what she unconsciously expected. The break no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a mirror. The narrator concludes this part on a calm note. Relationships often change not through dramatic acts, but through quiet decisions. When words are taken seriously, they gain weight. When boundaries are respected, dynamics reveal themselves. This story does not hinge on confrontation or revenge. It unfolds through restraint, clarity, and the subtle power of listening to what was actually said. At this point, both Laura and Daniel are standing in the reality created by their own choices, each processing the silence in very different ways. Silence has a way of revealing things that constant conversation can hide. When routine noise disappears, patterns become visible. In long relationships, those patterns often define who holds emotional control and who adapts around it. This part of the story matters because it shows how quickly certainty can shift when familiar roles are no longer performed. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Laura's days away from home had begun with a sense of relief. The first morning felt lighter. There were no shared schedules, no quiet expectations waiting to be met. She told herself that this distance was necessary, even healthy. She filled her time with walks, conversations, and distractions meant to quiet her thoughts. Yet as the days passed, something unexpected crept in. The absence she had requested did not feel empowering. It felt unresolved. Daniel, meanwhile, adjusted to his new routine with deliberate calm. He reorganized parts of the house that had long been ignored. He changed small habits that once revolved around compromise. Evenings became predictable in a different way. He cooked for one, read before bed, and slept without interruption. There was a subtle sense of relief in not having to anticipate moods or interpret silences. For the first time in a long while, his emotional energy felt contained within his own boundaries. The narrator pauses to point out an important distinction. Distance does not automatically weaken attachment. Sometimes it clarifies it. When constant accommodation stops, both people are forced to confront what remains. Laura noticed the change through their brief exchanges. Daniel's replies were not cold, but they were unmistakably different. He answered questions directly, without elaboration. He did not ask follow-up questions. There were no emotional bridges built into his words. Each message ended cleanly, without inviting continuation. This unsettled her. In the past, Daniel had filled gaps quickly. He had offered reassurance before it was requested. Now, he allowed silence to exist between messages. Laura found herself rereading his responses, searching for tone, meaning, or hidden emotion. There was none. Only clarity. A week into the break, Laura suggested meeting for coffee. The message was casual, framed as friendly and low pressure. Daniel agreed, naming a time and place without hesitation. His response did not carry urgency or reluctance. It was neutral. When they met, the conversation stayed polite. They spoke about ordinary things. Laura mentioned how strange the days felt. Daniel listened, nodding occasionally, but he did not rush to interpret her feelings. He did not attempt to draw conclusions. When the meeting ended, he stood, wished her well, and left without lingering. The narrator observes that moments like this often feel unsettling because they lack drama. There is no argument to resolve, no emotional spike to explain away. Instead, there is restraint. And restraint forces awareness. After that meeting, Laura's uncertainty deepened. She began to question what she had expected the break to achieve. She had imagined missing Daniel, but she had also imagined being missed. The second part was now unclear. The space she had requested was being honored fully, without negotiation. Daniel, on his side, reflected quietly. He noticed how little he felt compelled to explain himself. This absence of urgency was new. It did not come from detachment, but from acceptance. He had accepted that Laura wanted distance. He had also accepted that he no longer needed to perform emotional reassurance on demand. Here, the narrator offers analysis. In many relationships, emotional labor becomes invisible. One partner carries it consistently, while the other grows accustomed to its presence. When that labor stops, the change can feel abrupt, even threatening. Laura's messages shifted again. They became more reflective. She shared doubts, spoke about feeling disconnected, and hinted at confusion. Daniel responded with empathy, but not self-sacrifice. He acknowledged her feelings without positioning himself as the solution. This distinction mattered. Daniel was no longer trying to manage Laura's emotional state. He was allowing her to sit with it. The difference was subtle, but powerful. The tension between them was not loud. It lived in pauses, in unanswered expectations, and in the realization that old patterns were no longer guaranteed. Laura felt exposed in a way she had not anticipated. The break was revealing more than she had planned to examine. The narrator slows the pace here, emphasizing that transformation often begins quietly, not through confrontation, but through the removal of familiar comforts. When those comforts disappear, people are forced to face their own assumptions. As the week drew to a close, Laura found herself reconsidering the meaning of the break. It was no longer just about space, it was about consequences. Daniel had taken her words seriously, and in doing so, he had changed the emotional landscape between them. This part of the story ends at a moment of internal tension rather than action. Both individuals are adjusting to a new reality shaped not by arguments, but by restraint. The silence between them is no longer empty. It is full of awareness, and it lingers without resolution. Distance does more than separate people physically. Over time, it exposes assumptions that were never spoken aloud. This part of the story focuses on that exposure, the quiet moment when expectations collide with reality and neither person can pretend they did not notice. Laura began to feel restless. The break no longer felt temporary in the way she had imagined. Each day carried a faint sense of imbalance, as if something important had shifted without a clear explanation. She replayed past conversations in her mind, trying to locate the point where control had subtly slipped away. What unsettled her most was not Daniel's silence, but its consistency. He was no longer reacting, he was choosing. Daniel, meanwhile, noticed changes in himself that felt both unfamiliar and grounding. He was more attentive to his own needs. He made decisions without second-guessing how they might be received. This was not a withdrawal from the relationship, but a return to himself. He was still open to conversation, but no longer positioned himself as the emotional anchor holding everything together. The narrator pauses here to reflect on a common pattern. When one partner has long been the stabilizing force, their decision to step back often feels like abandonment, even when it is not. The stability was mistaken for obligation. Laura suggested meeting again, this time for a longer conversation. She said she wanted clarity. Daniel agreed. They chose a quiet place, neutral and familiar. When they sat down, Laura spoke first. She described feeling uncertain, disconnected, and unsure whether the break was helping. She asked Daniel how he felt. Daniel answered honestly, but without defensiveness. He said he had been using the time to reflect as well. He explained that he had realized how much of their relationship depended on him smoothing over discomfort. He said the space had helped him understand the importance of balance. Laura listened, but his words unsettled her. She had expected reassurance or an expression of longing. Instead, she heard calm reflection. Daniel was not asking her to come back. He was not presenting himself as incomplete without her. He was simply sharing his perspective. The narrator notes that this is often the moment when uncertainty intensifies. When reassurance is not offered, people are forced to confront their own expectations rather than relying on familiar responses. Laura asked whether Daniel still wanted the marriage. He said he valued what they had built, but also valued mutual respect and clarity. He explained that taking her request seriously had changed how he viewed their dynamic. He no longer wanted to return to patterns that left him feeling secondary to unspoken expectations. This conversation did not escalate into conflict. There were no raised voices. Instead, there was a steady exchange marked by restraint. Laura felt a growing discomfort, not because Daniel was unkind, but because he was no longer predictable. After they parted, Laura felt unsettled. The break had begun as a way to regain control over her own emotions. Now, it felt like she was losing control over the narrative she had assumed would unfold. She began to question whether she had mistaken emotional availability for permanence. Daniel returned home with a sense of clarity. The conversation had confirmed something he had suspected quietly. He was no longer willing to measure his worth by how urgently he was needed. He wanted presence, not dependency. The narrator offers analysis at this point. When emotional roles shift, discomfort is inevitable. One person learns to stand without leaning. The other must decide whether they can meet that change honestly. In the days that followed, communication slowed again, not out of avoidance, but because neither felt compelled to fill the silence. Laura spent more time reflecting on her motivations. She recognized that her request for space had been made with expectations she had not fully acknowledged. Daniel, on his side, felt steady. The uncertainty that once dominated his thoughts had softened. He was no longer waiting for direction. He was observing, evaluating, and choosing. This part ends without resolution. The distance remains, but it has taken on a different quality. It is no longer just physical separation. It is a space where both individuals are forced to confront who they are without the roles they once relied on. When roles shift, the most difficult adjustment is often internal. This part of the story centers on that adjustment, the moment when awareness replaces habit and both people are forced to sit with truths they once avoided. Laura began to understand that the break had changed more than distance. It had altered the emotional structure she had relied on for years. She noticed how often she reached for her phone with the expectation of reassurance, only to stop herself. Daniel's responses were still respectful, but they no longer arrived with the emotional cushioning she had grown used to. There was no tension in his words, only clarity. That clarity felt heavier than silence. Daniel continued his routine with steady intention. He was not avoiding Laura, nor was he rehearsing outcomes. He focused on what felt stable: work, health, quiet evenings, and conversations with friends that did not revolve around uncertainty. He noticed how little anxiety accompanied his days now. The constant need to anticipate emotional shifts had faded. In its place was a sense of grounded presence. The narrator pauses to explain why this stage is often the most uncomfortable. When emotional dependency weakens, both partners feel exposed. One feels the loss of control. The other feels the return of autonomy. Neither experience is dramatic, but both are profound. Laura suggested another conversation, this time without framing it as problem-solving. She said she wanted to understand where things stood. Daniel agreed, appreciating the honesty of the request. When they met, Laura spoke more slowly than before. She admitted that she had expected the break to bring clarity without consequences. She acknowledged that she had not considered how seriously Daniel would take her words. Daniel listened carefully. He did not interrupt or correct her. When it was his turn to speak, he explained that taking her request seriously had forced him to confront his own patterns. He realized how often he had prioritized maintaining harmony over expressing discomfort. The space had allowed him to step back and see that clearly. The narrator notes that this kind of conversation marks a shift from reaction to reflection. It is no longer about winning or convincing. It is about understanding what has already changed. Laura asked whether things could return to how they were before. Daniel answered honestly. He said he did not want to return to a version of the relationship where his presence depended on emotional availability alone. He wanted mutual effort and clear boundaries. His tone was calm, not demanding. Laura felt the weight of that answer. It was not rejection, but it was not reassurance either. It required her to consider her own role more carefully. For the first time, she saw that the break had not paused the relationship. It had transformed it. Afterward, Laura spent time alone, reflecting on how often she had assumed emotional support was permanent, simply because it had always been there. She began to recognize that security built on assumption is fragile. The discomfort she felt was not caused by Daniel's distance, but by her own unexamined expectations. Daniel, too, reflected. He recognized that clarity came with responsibility. He was no longer willing to hide behind accommodation. Whatever direction the relationship took, he wanted it to be based on mutual awareness rather than habit. The narrator offers a final reflection for this part. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives through quiet realizations and honest conversations. When both people stop performing their expected roles, what remains is truth, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes liberating. This part ends with both Laura and Daniel standing in that truth. There is no argument, no dramatic decision, only a shared awareness that the relationship cannot continue unchanged. Whatever comes next must be built on intention rather than assumption. Clarity often arrives quietly, without a single defining moment. It settles in through reflection, through the steady acceptance of what can no longer be ignored. In the final part of this story, the focus is not on dramatic resolution, but on the consequences of honesty and the kind of closure that comes from self-respect rather than victory. After their last conversation, Laura stopped framing her thoughts around uncertainty and began looking at them with honesty. The break had given her time, but it had also revealed something uncomfortable. She had wanted space without risk. She had wanted distance without change. What she encountered instead was accountability. Daniel had not chased, demanded, or withdrawn in anger. He had simply listened and adjusted. That adjustment forced her to confront how much she had relied on his emotional availability without recognizing its cost. Daniel, on his side, felt a steady sense of resolve. The clarity he had gained did not make him indifferent. It made him deliberate. He understood that caring for someone did not require constant accommodation. He had learned that respect for another person must include respect for oneself. This realization did not harden him. It grounded him. The narrator pauses here to reflect on a broader truth. Many relationships falter not because of conflict, but because expectations remain unspoken. When one person finally acts on what is said instead of what is implied, the imbalance becomes visible. That visibility can feel threatening, but it is also honest. Laura reached out one final time, asking to talk without assumptions. When they met, the tone was different from before. There was no urgency, no testing of reactions. She acknowledged that the break had changed her understanding of the relationship. She admitted that she had expected Daniel to remain emotionally available, regardless of distance. Saying it out loud stripped the assumption of its power. Daniel responded with calm clarity. He said he cared about her, but he no longer wanted a relationship built on uncertainty or silent expectations. He explained that taking her words seriously had helped him recognize what he needed moving forward. He wanted mutual presence, not conditional closeness. This conversation did not end with raised voices or dramatic declarations. It ended with understanding. Both recognized that the relationship they had known could not simply resume as it was. The break had done its work. It had revealed boundaries that could not be unseen. The narrator offers a final analysis. Respect is not proven through pursuit. It is shown through consistency, clarity, and the willingness to accept consequences. When words are spoken, they carry weight. When they are honored, they reshape dynamics. Laura left the conversation with a quiet awareness of her own role. Daniel returned home with a sense of closure rooted in self-respect. There was no triumph in this ending, only resolution. The space that once felt ambiguous now had meaning. The story concludes with a simple truth. Relationships either grow through honesty or dissolve under the weight of unexamined expectations. When one person finally takes words seriously, the outcome is not punishment, it is clarity. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.